The explosion rocked the Aegis Falcon, sending it into an uncontrollable spiral toward the acid deserts of Iridia 7. Lieutenant Nathan "Nate" Reyes gripped his seat as emergency lights flooded the cabin with crimson. Through the viewport, he could see the Zauthar anti-aircraft fire continuing to track their descent. "Brace for impact," the pilot screamed over the comms. "Hull breach imminent!" Nate checked his survival gear one last time. Atmospheric converter, acid-resistant armor, tactical scanner. His mission as a Terran Alliance scout was simple: infiltrate, gather intel on Zauthar defense systems, rendezvous with the extraction team in 36 hours. But as the ship plummeted through the orange-tinted atmosphere, he knew nothing would go according to plan. The Falcon split apart before impact. Nate's escape pod ejected automatically, its thrusters firing erratically. His last glimpse of his 4 squad mates showed their pods shooting in completely different directions. The communication system crackled with static, then died entirely as the acid rain corroded the external antenna. "Command, this is Lieutenant Reyes. Squad separated. Communications failing. Proceeding with primary mission parameters." Only silence answered him as his pod crashed into the shifting acid sands of Iridia 7, the impact knocking him unconscious. When Nate awakened, the dual suns of the Iridia system were already high in the sky. His pod had half sunk into the corrosive sand, its metal exterior hissing as the acid slowly ate through the protective coating. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, rolling dunes of orange-red sand, occasional rock formations, and in the distance, what appeared to be shallow acid lakes that shimmered under the harsh sunlight. He checked his equipment. The communications array was completely destroyed. His armor had sustained damage during the crash, and acid had begun to seep through a crack near his left ankle, causing a minor chemical burn. Using a metal fragment from the damaged pod, he fashioned a makeshift patch, wincing as the acid-resistant sealant stung against his raw skin. "Perfect," he muttered to himself. "Dropped in enemy territory. No comms, damaged gear, and not even a hint of where my team landed." He pulled up his tactical display, but the local interference was scrambling the positioning system. The mission objectives remained clear, but their execution now seemed nearly impossible. Still, Nate was not known among the K-20 Scout Squadron as the survivor for nothing. He scanned his surroundings methodically. The air shimmered with heat, sand particles suspended in the acidic atmosphere. Each breath through his filter felt heavy and artificial. Without a clear direction, Nate relied on his training: find higher ground, establish bearings, locate water and shelter. His eyes settled on a rocky outcropping about 2 kilometers to the east. It would provide a better vantage point, and perhaps some protection from the elements. One step at a time, he reminded himself, shouldering his survival pack and beginning the treacherous trek across the acid sands. The journey was slow and punishing. Each step required careful placement to avoid sinking too deeply into the corrosive terrain. By the time Nate reached the rock formation, the first sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the desert. The temperature, which had been nearly unbearable during the day, began to drop rapidly. As he climbed the jagged rocks, his boots slipping on the smooth, wind-polished surface, Nate noticed something unusual: a thin wisp of vapor rising from behind the formation. It wasn't the typical acid fog that gathered in the lowlands at night. This was more directional, almost like steam. Cautiously, he circled around to investigate, his hand hovering near his sidearm. What he discovered was unexpected: a small vent in the ground, no more than half a meter wide, from which the vapor was steadily escaping. More importantly, the rock around the vent showed signs of artificial modification, subtle geometric patterns that nature couldn't have formed. "Zauthar architecture," Nate whispered to himself, recognizing the distinct hexagonal motifs from his pre-mission briefings. Kneeling beside the vent, he realized it wasn't just a random opening. It was an air exchange port for something much larger underground. The Zauthar were known for their extensive subterranean networks, especially on hostile worlds like Iridia 7. This could be his way in. The opening was barely large enough for him to squeeze through, but Nate knew he had limited options. Night on Iridia 7 meant temperatures dropping well below freezing, and his damaged armor wouldn't provide adequate protection. More importantly, if there was a Zauthar facility below, it might contain the strategic information he was sent to recover, or at least communications equipment he could repurpose. With a deep breath, he lowered himself into the vent, using his armor's built-in light to illuminate the narrow passage. The descent was steep but manageable, with occasional handholds carved into the rock. After about 20 meters, the shaft opened into a much larger tunnel. The architecture was unmistakably Zauthar, angular, efficient, with bioluminescent strips embedded in the walls that emitted a soft blue glow. But something felt off. The air was stale. The light strips flickered intermittently, and a thin layer of dust covered the floor. This facility wasn't abandoned, but it certainly wasn't operating at full capacity either. Nate moved silently through the tunnels, his tactical training taking over. Each intersection required careful consideration, each sound a potential threat. He mapped his progress mentally, creating a rough layout of the underground network. The complex was extensive, with multiple levels connected by spiral ramps and occasional vertical shafts. Hours passed as he explored deeper. Most rooms were empty or contained obsolete equipment, suggesting this was an older installation, perhaps repurposed for the current conflict. Then he found something remarkable: a water processing station, still operational, drawing from what appeared to be an underground aquifer. The system was filtering the acidic water from above, making it safe for consumption. This discovery was a lifeline. Nate used his canteen to collect the purified water, knowing hydration would be critical to his survival. He also noticed that the plant life growing near the water filters, some type of acid-resistant vegetation, could potentially serve as emergency rations or even material for repairing his damaged armor. As he gathered supplies, a distant sound echoed through the tunnels, a chittering, scraping noise, unlike anything in the Terran biological database for Iridia 7. Nate froze, dimming his light and pressing himself against the wall. The sound grew closer, a mixture of clicking mandibles and the soft padding of multiple limbs against the stone floor. Then he saw it, a creature approximately 1 meter in length, with a body structure that seemed to be a hybrid between reptile and insect. Its exoskeleton was a dull gray with metallic highlights, 6 limbs ending in blue-green pincers, and what appeared to be sensory antennae protruding from its elongated head. Most disturbing were its eyes, compound structures that reflected Nate's light in prismatic patterns. The creature paused at the entrance to the water chamber, its antennae twitching as it sensed Nate's presence. For a tense moment, neither moved. Then the creature hissed, displaying a row of needle-like teeth, and charged. Nate's combat training kicked in. He sidestepped the initial lunge, using the creature's momentum against it. It crashed into the water filtration system, momentarily stunned. Before it could recover, Nate had his sidearm trained on it, finger tensing on the trigger. But he hesitated. Direct combat would attract attention, and if there were more of these creatures, or worse, Zauthar patrols, nearby, the noise would compromise his position. Instead, he backed slowly toward the exit, keeping his weapon aimed at the creature. As he moved, he noticed something unexpected: a fresh wound on the creature's side, oozing a bluish fluid. The injury didn't appear to be from combat. Rather, it looked like the result of an accident or perhaps infighting among its species. The creature was young, possibly separated from its pack. In that moment of observation, the unexpected happened. The creature stopped its aggressive display and began to make a different sound, a softer, almost plaintive chirping. It didn't advance further, but seemed to be studying Nate with equal curiosity. Drawing on his knowledge of xenobiology, Nate recognized that the creature might not be inherently hostile. Its initial aggression could have been defensive, triggered by pain and fear. On a hostile world like Iridia 7, every species had to fight for survival, making a split-second decision that would later prove pivotal. Nate slowly holstered his weapon and instead reached for his medkit. The creature tensed but didn't attack as he extracted a strip of cloth and a vial of alkaline solution, an antidote to the ubiquitous acids of Iridia 7. "Easy there," he murmured, his voice soft, despite knowing the creature couldn't understand him. "I'm not going to hurt you." With excruciatingly slow movements, he prepared a makeshift bandage by soaking the cloth in the alkaline solution. The creature watched, its antennae constantly moving, assessing the unfamiliar human. Nate placed the bandage on the ground and stepped back. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then, with surprising delicacy, the creature approached the cloth, sniffed it with its antennae, and to Nate's amazement, dragged it across its wound. The alkaline solution neutralized any acid in the injury, and the cloth provided basic protection. This interaction marked the beginning of what would become an unlikely alliance. Over the next few hours, Nate observed as the creature became less defensive in his presence. He began to call it Skreek, after the distinctive sound it made when detecting something of interest. By the time the short night cycle of Iridia 7 had passed, Nate had established a rudimentary rapport with Skreek. The creature would keep its distance but followed him as he continued to explore the underground complex. Its behavior suggested intelligence far beyond basic instinct. It seemed to understand Nate's intentions and even began to guide him through the tunnels, using its superior knowledge of the layout. This guidance proved invaluable when, during their exploration of a deeper level, they encountered signs of recent Zaothar activity, fresh footprints in the dust, operational equipment, and security systems that required circumvention. Skreek's acute senses provided early warning of patrols, allowing Nate to avoid direct contact. It was during one such evasion that they discovered something significant: a weapons cache, seemingly abandoned in haste. Among the various Zaothar armaments was a Shi-47 light assault rifle, a weapon Nate recognized from intelligence briefings. The Zaothar considered it outdated, but its design was adaptable and its ammunition plentiful. More intriguing was a marking on the weapon's stock, a small blue flower insignia, the emblem of the Terran Blue Lotus, a covert operations unit rumored to have infiltrated deep into Zaothar territory. If they had been here, perhaps they had left other resources Nate could use. Armed with the G-47 and with Skreek as his guide, Nate pressed deeper into the facility. His chronometer indicated he had been on Iridia 7 for nearly 24 hours, half of his eventual disappearance period. The extraction window had passed, and by now, his squadron would have reported him missing in action, possibly presumed dead after the pod crash. This realization brought a wave of isolation but also clarity. Without extraction, his mission parameters expanded: survive, gather as much intelligence as possible, and find a way to return to Terran lines with that information. The underground complex had provided shelter and resources, but it was also a labyrinth that could become his tomb if he wasn't careful. The partnership with Skreek continued to evolve as they ventured further. The creature seemed to grow more comfortable with Nate's presence, occasionally bringing him small objects it found, pieces of technology, unusual minerals, once even a type of fungi that proved to be edible and nutritious. In return, Nate shared his rations and treated Skreek's wound, which was healing rapidly under his care. As they explored, Nate began to notice a pattern in the facility's layout. What had initially seemed like random tunnels revealed themselves as a structured network, with specific areas dedicated to different functions: storage, habitation, security, and what appeared to be a central command center. If strategic information existed in this complex, that would be where to find it. The command center was more heavily secured than other areas, with functioning automated defenses and occasional Ziothar patrols. Nate observed their routines, noting the changing of guards and the blind spots in their security systems. Skreek proved invaluable here, its natural camouflage and knowledge of alternative routes, allowing them to gather intelligence without detection. On the second day, Nate made a critical discovery. While monitoring a patrol from a concealed position, he overheard a Ziothar officer discussing a northern defensive realignment in response to Terran activity near the transmission corridor. This confirmed what Terran intelligence had suspected. The Ziothar were reinforcing their northern perimeter, potentially leaving their southern flank vulnerable. This information alone would be valuable, but Nate needed proof, detailed maps, deployment orders, anything that would verify the strategic shift. Such evidence would likely be stored in the command center's databanks. Infiltrating the command center would be their most dangerous undertaking yet. Nate spent hours preparing, studying patrol patterns, identifying security measures, and planning his approach. Skreek, seeming to understand the gravity of the situation, remained unusually still and quiet during this preparation, only occasionally nudging Nate towards specific tunnel entrances that offered better concealment. The opportunity came during a shift change, when the command center was at its least staffed. Using the She-47's compatible technology, a fortunate side effect of Ziothar weapon design, Nate bypassed the outer security lock. Skreek remained at the entrance, its posture suggesting it would warn of approaching danger. Inside, the command center was a marvel of Ziothar efficiency. Holographic displays, integrated communication systems, and, at its center, a three-dimensional tactical map of the entire region. Nate worked quickly, downloading data onto a portable storage device he had salvaged from his damaged equipment. The map revealed exactly what he had hoped: a comprehensive layout of the Ziothar underground defensive network, including weak points, supply lines, and command structures. As he was completing the download, an alarm sounded, not for his intrusion, but for an unrelated security breach elsewhere in the complex. The unexpected distraction worked in his favor, drawing guards away from the command center. However, it also meant that the facility was now on high alert. Reuniting with Skreek, they began their retreat through the tunnels, now significantly more dangerous as Ziothar forces mobilized to address the security breach. Their escape route was cut off twice, forcing them to improvise new paths through less stable sections of the complex. During this retreat, they encountered two Ziothar guards. Nate had no choice but to engage, using the She-47 with surprising effectiveness. The weapon's neural interface adapted to his human physiology better than expected, allowing for precise targeting despite the unfamiliar design. The confrontation, though brief, alerted other security forces to their location. What followed was a desperate chase through the labyrinthine tunnels, with Nate and Skreek barely staying ahead of their pursuers. They eventually reached a section of the complex that seemed older, less maintained, where the tunnels began to merge with natural caverns. It was here that they encountered something unexpected: a larger group of creatures like Skreek, clearly a hunting pack. Their reaction to Nate was immediately hostile, but Skreek intervened with a series of complex vocalizations and physical displays. The pack hesitated, and then, remarkably, parted to allow them passage. This interaction revealed another dimension to the creatures. They had a sophisticated social structure and communication system. Skreek, despite its youth and injury, held some status that commanded respect, enough to protect a human intruder in their territory. By the time they reached the surface again, emerging through a different vent than the one Nate had initially discovered, nearly 36 hours had passed since his crash landing. The strategic data he had acquired was secure, and with Skreek's continued guidance, they began the treacherous journey across the acid deserts toward what Nate hoped were Terran lines. The surface travel proved even more challenging than the underground navigation. Acid storms swept across the desert, forcing them to seek shelter in rock formations or temporary burrows that Skreek seemed adept at locating. The temperature extremes, blistering heat during the day, freezing cold at night, tested the limits of Nate's damaged environmental systems. Food and water became increasingly scarce. Nate rationed his supplies carefully, sharing with Skreek, who in turn led him to hidden water sources, small underground springs where the acid content was low enough to be filtered using his remaining purification tablets. Their progress was slow but steady. Nate maintained a rough heading, based on stellar navigation, during the brief, clear periods at night, knowing that the nearest Terran outpost should be approximately 30 kilometers to the west of his crash site. Without precise instruments, however, his navigation remained approximate at best. As they approached what Nate estimated to be the final stretch of their journey, disaster struck. A Zauthar patrol, likely sent to investigate the security breach at the underground facility, spotted them crossing an exposed section of the desert. The ensuing firefight was brief but intense. Nate used the She-47 effectively, its energy pulses cutting through the acidic atmosphere with deadly precision. Skreek proved surprisingly adept in combat, using its speed and knowledge of the terrain to flank the Zauthar soldiers. Together, they eliminated the immediate threat, but not before Nate sustained damage to his armor and a minor shrapnel wound to his shoulder. More concerning was that the engagement would surely bring reinforcements. They needed to move quickly now, abandoning caution for speed. Skreek seemed to understand the urgency, leading Nate on a more direct but perilous route across acid lakes, using partially submerged rock bridges that only the creature's keen vision could detect. The final hours of their journey became a blur of exhaustion, pain, and determination. Nate's combat stimulants had long since been depleted, and he pushed forward on sheer willpower alone. Skreek remained steadfast, occasionally nudging or even pulling Nate when his pace faltered. Then, as the dual suns began to rise on what would be the 48th hour since his disappearance, Nate saw it, the outline of a Terran forward outpost, its defensive perimeter shimmering in the early morning light. They had made it. The approach to the outpost presented one final challenge. Terran defense systems would identify Skreek as a hostile life form and respond with lethal force. Nate had to ensure both their safety during the final approach. Using components from his damaged equipment and the G-47, he improvised a crude identification beacon, broadcasting on a Terran emergency frequency. The signal was weak, but should be enough to prevent the automated defense systems from firing immediately, giving him time to establish communication. As they emerged from the cover of a rock formation onto the open ground before the outpost, alarms sounded. Defensive turrets tracked their movement, but held fire. The beacon was working. Then a voice crackled over a loudspeaker. "Unidentified personnel approaching south perimeter. Halt and identify." Nate raised his hand slowly, keeping Skreek close beside him. "Lieutenant Nathan Reyes, K-20 Scout Squadron. ID code Alpha Sierra 793. Requesting emergency entry and decontamination." There was a long pause. Then, "Lieutenant Reyes was reported KIA 47 hours ago. Verification required." "I was separated during the Falcon crash," Nate called back, his voice hoarse from the acidic air. "I have critical intelligence on Zauthar defensive positions and a specimen of local fauna requiring containment and study." Another pause. Longer this time. Nate could imagine the confusion inside the outpost. A presumed dead scout appearing with an alien creature and claiming to have vital intelligence. Finally, the perimeter gate began to open, and armed soldiers emerged, weapons trained on both Nate and Skreek. "The creature is non-hostile," Nate said quickly, placing a hand on Skreek's back to keep it calm. "It's the reason I'm alive. We need to secure it, not eliminate it." The tension was palpable as they were escorted inside the outpost. Skreek remained unusually docile, seeming to understand that any aggressive movement would result in its immediate destruction. The soldiers maintained a cautious distance, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and wariness. Once inside, the full impact of Nate's return became apparent. Medical personnel swarmed him, beginning immediate treatment for acid exposure, dehydration, and his various injuries. Security officers confiscated the She-47 and the data storage device, rushing them to intelligence analysts and scientists, summoned hastily from their laboratories, approached Skreek with a combination of fear and fascination. Captain Sarah Jensen, head of the medical response team, was the first to address him directly once the initial flurry of activity had subsided. "Lieutenant, your condition is remarkable. By all accounts, extended exposure to Iridia 7's environment should have resulted in severe acid burns, respiratory damage, and nutrient deprivation. Yet your injuries are relatively minor." Nate managed a weak smile. "I had help," he said, gesturing toward Skreek, who was now being carefully contained within a transparent observation chamber. "And I found shelter in an abandoned Zauthar facility." "Not abandoned," a new voice interjected. Major Kazimir, Kaz Pavlov, Nate's direct commanding officer, stepped into the medical bay. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of relief and suspicion. 48 hours behind enemy lines, presumed dead, and you return with an alien creature, enemy weaponry, and what intelligence is already calling the most significant strategic data we've acquired in months. Explanation required, Lieutenant. Over the next several hours, Nate provided a detailed account of his experiences: the crash, the discovery of the underground complex, his encounter with Skreek, and the subsequent alliance that had developed. He explained how Skreek had guided him through the tunnels, warned him of danger, and ultimately helped him escape with the crucial map of Zauthar defensive positions. As he spoke, medical teams continued their examination, confirming Captain Jensen's initial assessment. Despite the hostile environment and lack of proper equipment, Nate had survived with minimal physical trauma. His explanation of using alkaline solutions from the water filtration system to neutralize acid exposure, combined with the protective elements of the underground complex, provided a partial explanation for this miracle of survival. The intelligence he had gathered, meanwhile, was being validated and analyzed by the highest levels of Terran command. The data storage device contained not just maps, but operational codes, communication frequencies, and deployment schedules, a comprehensive overview of the Zauthar defensive network. Major Pavlov's initial skepticism gradually gave way to cautious acceptance as the intelligence proved accurate and actionable. "The question remains," he said, after listening to Nate's full report. "Why did you prioritize intelligence gathering over rendezvous with potential survivors from your squad?" "Sir, initial scans showed no other emergency beacons within range," Nate replied. "With communications down and no way to coordinate a search, the mission objective took priority: gather intelligence on Zauthar defenses and return it to command." This explanation seemed to satisfy Pavlov, though a shadow of doubt remained in his expression. "And the creature, this Skreek, you believe it assisted you intentionally, not merely as a means to ensure its own survival?" Before Nate could respond, an alert sounded from the observation chamber where Skreek was being held. The creature had become agitated, clawing at the transparent walls and producing a high-pitched keening sound that penetrated even the soundproof barriers. "It's distressed," Nate said, moving toward the chamber despite protest from medical staff. "It's not accustomed to confinement." As he approached, Skreek's behavior changed immediately. The creature pressed itself against the wall nearest to Nate, its antennae extended fully, vibrating in what he had come to recognize as a sign of recognition. "I've never seen anything like this." A new voice commented. Dr. Marisol Liang, the outpost's lead xenobiologist, had been observing the interaction from a monitoring station. Iridia 7's apex predators, particularly the skreek species, have always been classified as untamable and inherently aggressive toward all other life forms. Yet this specimen displays clear signs of bonding. Nate placed his hand against the transparent barrier. It saved my life multiple times, guided me through tunnels, warned me of patrols, even fought alongside me. That's not just instinct or coincidence. Dr. Liang approached cautiously, her scientific curiosity evidently overcoming her apprehension. The implications are significant. If skreek can form cooperative relationships, it challenges everything we understand about Iridia 7's ecology and the psychological profile of its dominant predator species. This moment of scientific contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant General Helena Wright, Commander of Strategic Operations for the Terran Alliance in this sector. Her presence brought an immediate shift in the atmosphere, the casual scientific inquiry replaced by military formality. Lieutenant Reyes, she acknowledged with a curt nod. Your intelligence has been verified and is already being incorporated into our strategic planning. The map you recovered shows a critical vulnerability in the Ziothar southern defensive line, a blind spot we weren't aware existed. Nate straightened as much as his injuries allowed, offering a salute. Thank you, General. I'm glad the intelligence will be useful. Useful is an understatement, General Wright replied. It's a game changer. The Ziothar have been reinforcing their northern perimeter, assuming our main thrust would come through the transmission corridor. With this information, we can redirect our forces to exploit the southern weakness instead. She turned her attention to skreek, studying the creature with clinical detachment. And this specimen, Major Pavlov informs me it was instrumental in your survival and escape. Yes, ma'am. Without skreek, I wouldn't have navigated the underground complex successfully or evaded Ziothar patrols. General Wright's expression remained neutral, but Nate could see the calculations happening behind her eyes. Strategic assessments, risk evaluations, potential applications. Dr. Liang, your preliminary assessment of the creature's capabilities and potential value. Dr. Liang straightened, shifting seamlessly from curious scientist to military advisor. Initial observations suggest intelligence far beyond our previous understanding of the species. Problem-solving abilities, social structures, and most significantly, the capacity to form cooperative relationships with non-skreek entities. From a military perspective, the strategic implications are substantial. Elaborate, Wright commanded. If we can understand and replicate Lieutenant Reyes's success in forming an alliance with this specimen, it could potentially lead to the development of biological assets for reconnaissance, sabotage, or direct combat support on Iridia 7. The skreek's natural adaptation to the environment gives them advantages no Terran technology can match. The general nodded slowly. Begin a comprehensive research program immediately. Priority status. I want to know everything about this creature, strengths, weaknesses, training potential, biological systems, everything. General, Nate interjected, surprising himself with his boldness. Skreek isn't just a potential weapon. It's a sentient being that made choices. Choices that saved my life. Any research program needs to account for that. Wright's gaze sharpened. Your concern is noted, Lieutenant. But in war, we use every advantage available. This creature, whatever bond you believe you formed with it, represents a potential tactical edge we cannot ignore. The discussion was interrupted by a strategic alert. Ziothar forces had been detected, mobilizing near the outpost's location, possibly in response to Nate's escape, or the patrol he had eliminated. General Wright immediately shifted focus, issuing rapid commands to strengthen the outpost's defenses and prepare for possible engagement. As military personnel scrambled to their positions, Nate found himself momentarily alone with Skreek. The creature had calmed somewhat but still showed signs of distress at its confinement. Through the transparent barrier, their eyes met, Nate's human ones and Skreek's alien compound structures. And in that moment, he felt a connection that transcended species. "I'll make sure they treat you right," he promised quietly. "You didn't just help me survive. You showed me something important, that even in the harshest environments, cooperation can triumph over conflict." The next 24 hours passed in a blur of activity. Nate's intelligence sparked an immediate strategic response from Terran Command. A battle group was hastily assembled to exploit the southern vulnerability in the Ziothar defenses, while diversionary forces maintained pressure on the northern perimeter to prevent redeployment. Nate himself was debriefed multiple times, each session more detailed than the last, as intelligence officers extracted every scrap of information about the underground complex, Ziothar patrol patterns, and the defensive systems he had observed. The She-47 weapon was thoroughly examined, its neural interface technology providing additional insights into Ziothar military capabilities. Meanwhile, Skreek became the center of an intensive research effort led by Dr. Liang. The creature was moved to a larger containment area, designed to mimic its natural environment, complete with acid-resistant vegetation and terrain features similar to those found in the underground caverns. Nate visited whenever his debriefings allowed, noting with satisfaction that Liang's approach emphasized observation and interaction rather than invasive procedures. "Its cellular regeneration is remarkable," Liang explained during one such visit. "The wound you treated is already completely healed, with no scarring or reduced functionality, and its neurological activity." She gestured to a monitor displaying complex wave patterns. "Suggests cognitive processes comparable to higher mammals, possibly even approaching lower primate levels." "I could have told you it was smart," Nate replied with a faint smile. "It understood tactics, recognized threats, even seemed to plan ahead." Liang nodded, her excitement barely contained. "What's most fascinating is its response to you specifically. Watch." She activated a series of recordings showing Skreek's behavior when different personnel entered its containment area. With most, it displayed varying degrees of wariness or aggression. But when Nate appeared, its posture changed completely. Relaxed, attentive, with that distinctive antennae vibration he had come to associate with recognition. "It's not just conditioning or habituation," Liang concluded. "It's a genuine social bond. The implications for our understanding of alien psychology are enormous." As Nate recovered and Skreek was studied, the strategic situation evolved rapidly. The battle group dispatched to exploit the southern vulnerability achieved significant gains, pushing deep into Ziothar territory and disrupting their command structure. Reports indicated confusion among enemy forces as they scrambled to reinforce positions they had believed secure. 3 days after his return, Nate was summoned to a strategic planning session aboard the command carrier Aegis Titan. The ship had arrived in orbit around Iridia 7 to coordinate the expanding offensive, and its presence signaled the importance Terran High Command placed on this unexpected opportunity. The meeting took place in the carrier's Strategic Command Center, a cavernous room dominated by a holographic tactical display. Present were General Wright, Major Pavlov, and several high-ranking officers Nate didn't recognize. More surprising was the presence of Dr. Liang, and most unexpected of all, Skreek itself, contained within a mobile observation unit. "Lieutenant Reyes," General Wright began once formalities were complete. "The intelligence you provided has already altered the course of this conflict. The Ziothar were caught completely unprepared for our southern thrust, and we've gained more ground in 3 days than in the previous 3 months." Nate nodded, uncomfortable with the praise but recognizing its significance. "Thank you, General. I'm glad the information proved valuable." "Beyond valuable," one of the unfamiliar officers interjected. It's given us an opening to potentially end this war, or at least shift it decisively in our favor. Wright continued. The reason for this meeting is twofold. First, to recognize your extraordinary service. You're being awarded the Border Star for exceptional courage and initiative behind enemy lines. The ceremony will take place tomorrow. Nate accepted this with a respectful nod, though accolades were far from his mind. And the second reason, ma'am. We need your expertise for the next phase of operations. With your first-hand knowledge of the underground complex and the surrounding terrain, you're uniquely qualified to lead a specialized insertion team back into that facility. Intelligence suggests it connects to a much larger network than we previously suspected, possibly extending all the way to the Ziothar Central Command structure on Iridia 7. The request wasn't unexpected, but Nate found himself hesitating. His experiences in those tunnels, the isolation, the constant danger, the uncertain path forward, had left deeper marks than his physical injuries. But there was something else, too, a growing conviction that his greatest value might lie elsewhere. General, with respect, I believe I can contribute more effectively in a different capacity, he said carefully. My experience with Skreek and survival on Iridia 7 represents a unique knowledge base that could benefit our scout teams more broadly. Wright's expression hardened slightly. Explain. The Zouthar know their underground network has been compromised. They'll have altered security protocols, increased patrols, maybe even collapsed sections to prevent further infiltration. But what they can't change quickly is the planet itself, the environment, the indigenous life forms, the natural challenges of survival. He gestured toward Skreek. What I learned about interacting with local fauna, finding water sources, navigating the acid deserts, that knowledge could be the difference between life and death for our scouts. I'm proposing a specialized training program, focusing on integrated survival techniques that incorporate indigenous resources, rather than relying solely on our technology. There was a moment of silence as Wright considered this proposal. Finally, she turned to Major Pavlov. Your assessment, Major. Pavlov's expression was thoughtful. Lieutenant Reyes has always been one of our most adaptable scouts. If he believes this approach has merit, I'm inclined to support it. Our casualty rates on Iridia 7 missions are concerning. Any edge we can give our personnel deserves consideration. After further discussion, a compromise was reached. Nate would not return to the underground complex immediately, but would instead develop and implement a specialized training program for scout teams operating on Iridia 7. This 48-hour battalion, as it was informally dubbed, would focus on rapid adaptation to hostile environments, indigenous resource utilization, and, if possible, cooperation with local fauna. As the meeting concluded, attention turned to Skreek, still watching the proceedings from its containment unit, with what Nate had come to recognize as intelligent curiosity. Which brings us to our final agenda item, General Wright said. Dr. Liang, your recommendation regarding the Skreek specimen? Liang stepped forward, activating a display that showed various data points from her research. Based on our studies, I recommend transitioning from containment to controlled integration. The specimen has demonstrated not only intelligence, but a capacity for cooperative behavior that could be invaluable for our operations on Iridia 7. Integration, one of the officers questioned. You're suggesting we use it as some kind of combat asset? Not precisely, Liang clarified. Rather, as Lieutenant Reyes has experienced, the Skreek species possesses knowledge of Iridia 7 that we simply cannot match. They know the terrain, the hidden water sources, the safe passages. More importantly, this particular specimen has already demonstrated willingness to share that knowledge. The discussion continued, weighing security concerns against potential benefits. Nate observed with growing satisfaction as the initial skepticism gave way to cautious consideration. The Skreek, his Skreek, was being recognized not just as a dangerous predator, but as a potential ally. Eventually, a decision was reached. Skreek would remain under observation, but with expanding freedoms as trust was established. It would be incorporated into Nate's training program, serving as both subject and, potentially, instructor for scouts learning to navigate Iridia 7's challenges. As the meeting dispersed, Nate found himself standing before Skreek's containment unit. The creature's antennae vibrated in that now familiar pattern of recognition, and it pressed a pincer against the transparent barrier. "Looks like we're going to be working together a while longer," Nate said quietly. "They're starting to understand what I already knew, that sometimes survival depends on finding allies in the most unexpected places." In the weeks that followed, the 48-hour battalion took shape under Nate's guidance. Elite scouts were trained not just in combat tactics, but in understanding Iridia 7 itself, its rhythms, its dangers, its hidden resources. Skreek became an integral part of this training, demonstrating hunting techniques, water location, and safe navigation through acid storms. Dr. Liang's research expanded as well, moving beyond a single specimen to broader studies of Skreek's social structures and communication. With Nate's assistance, she began to decode the complex antennae signals and vocalizations that constituted the creature's primary communication method. This research led to an unexpected breakthrough: the discovery that the larger Skreek population on Iridia 7 wasn't inherently hostile to humans. Rather, they had perceived Terran activities as territorial aggression and responded accordingly. With proper signals and behavior, peaceful interaction was possible. The strategic implications were significant. Scouts trained to communicate non-aggression to Skreek packs could traverse territories previously considered too dangerous, gathering intelligence without risking costly engagements. Some particularly adept scouts even began to form bonds similar to Nate's, though none quite matched the depth of his connection with the original Skreek. The war continued, but the nature of the conflict began to shift. The intelligence Nate had recovered, combined with the new capabilities of the 48-hour battalion, gave the Terran Alliance an unprecedented advantage. Zauthar forces found themselves consistently outmaneuvered, their once impenetrable underground network now vulnerable to infiltration by scouts who understood the planet as well as they did. 6 months after his miraculous return, Nate stood on the observation deck of the Terran Strategic Station, gazing out at the red deserts of Iridia 7. Beside him, Skreek moved freely. Its containment, long since replaced by a simple tracking device that it tolerated with good-natured resignation. "Lieutenant," Major Pavlov's voice came from behind them. "The latest reports from the Southern Front. Thought you'd want to see them." Nate accepted the datapad, scanning the information quickly. The offensive continued to gain ground, with minimal casualties thanks to the improved intelligence and survival rates of their scout teams. "The 48-hour battalion is making a difference," he observed, handing the pad back. 6 successful extractions this week alone, all with valuable intelligence. Pavlov nodded, his initial skepticism long since replaced by respect. "Your training methods have proven unorthodox but effective. Headquarters is considering implementing similar programs on other contested planets." This was welcome news. The principles Nate had developed, understanding indigenous ecosystems, adapting to hostile environments rather than fighting them, seeking cooperation where possible, had applications far beyond a single conflict or planet. As Pavlov departed, Nate returned his gaze to the horizon, where the dual suns were beginning to set, casting long shadows across the acid sands. Skreek chittered softly beside him, its antennae moving in patterns he now understood as contentment, mixed with alertness, always watching, always aware. "We've still got work to do, my friend," Nate said, placing a hand on Skreek's metallic gray carapace. The creature leaned slightly into his touch, a gesture that still amazed him despite its familiarity. Their story had already begun to spread throughout the Terran Alliance. The scout who disappeared for 48 hours behind enemy lines and returned with a map, a gun, and an alien ally. Some versions embellish the danger. Others emphasize the unlikely friendship. All recognize the fundamental truth that survival sometimes required looking beyond established boundaries and finding connection in the most hostile environments. As darkness fell over Iridia 7, Nate considered the future. The war would eventually end, one way or another. The maps would be redrawn, the weapons would fall silent. But the understanding gained of Iridia 7, of the Skreek, of the potential for cooperation across species, that would endure. In the distance, lights flickered on at the training grounds where the next generation of scouts was preparing for deployment. Among them would be those who had learned to see Iridia 7 not just as an enemy territory to be conquered, but as a complex ecosystem to be understood. And beside them, increasingly, would be Skreek companions, once feared as monsters, now recognized as Alliance emissaries, bridges between worlds. Skreek nudged Nate gently, drawing his attention to a new acid storm forming on the horizon. Together, they watched the swirling patterns of corrosive rain and lightning, a deadly beauty that no longer held the terror it once did. They had faced worse and survived, not by dominating their environment but by understanding it. "Tomorrow we start training the new group," Nate reminded his companion. "Think you're ready to show them how to find water under acid lakes?" Skreek's antennae vibrated in what Nate had come to recognize as enthusiasm, and he smiled. 48 hours had changed everything: his mission, his understanding, his purpose. What had begun as a desperate struggle for survival had transformed into something more significant: a new approach to coexistence in a hostile universe. As they turned to leave the observation deck, Nate reflected that perhaps this was the most valuable intelligence he had brought back from behind enemy lines. Not the map, not the weapon, but the living proof beside him that even in war, connection could triumph over conflict.